This is a second attempt for our second lecture on the psychology of reasoning. I see the sound is working now. So in our last class, we saw that Piaget had this theory about the importance of the development of concepts in the development of rationality. And a good illustration of this comes from an interview with a kindergartner. So there's an interview that's conducted by Frank Kyle at Yale University with a kindergartner. And he asks the kindergartner, it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon and the sun is shining really bright. You already ate something today, but you're still very hungry. So you decide to eat pancakes with syrup, orange juice, cereal, and milk. Could that be lunch? And the kindergartner responds, no, because lunch you have to have sandwiches and stuff like that. Well, can you have cereal for lunch? No. Can you have pancakes for lunch? No. Well, how do you know if something is lunch or not? If the time says 12 o'clock. Well, this was 12 o'clock. Well, I don't think so. So he goes back and he repeats the story. And then he says, is that lunch? And the kid says, I know, that one is not lunch. You have to eat sandwiches at lunch. Can you have anything else? You can have drinks, but not breakfast. So clearly this kindergartner's concept of lunch is not like an adult's concept of lunch. The child's concept of lunch doesn't weight very heavily the fact that it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon. In fact, the kid barely even registered that as a fact in the story at all. Rather, the thing that seems important to him is what you're eating. And this points to something important, and that is that the way that concepts change have an impact on children's thinking. So what are concepts? Well, concepts are mental groupings of more or less interchangeable elements. We have concepts of objects like dog and island, concepts of events like lunch and birthday, concepts of qualities like sweet and fast, and concepts for highfalutin philosophical abstractions like the true and the good. And concepts are important because they are basic elements of thinking. In language, most words symbolize concepts. Now, not all concepts are symbolized by words, so you might have a concept like old enough to be president, but we don't have a word for that. And some languages have words for concepts that we have, even though we don't have words for them. So the German word Schadenfreude, for example, refers to a concept that we probably recognize, which is the joy that you take in another person's misfortune. They also have a word that means the suffering you take in another person's joy, which is kind of creepy. But in any case, the fact that most of our words symbolize concepts are what makes translation possible. So dog and the French word chien both symbolize a mental grouping of dogs and everything that we know about dogs. And so when we know the translation between dog and chien, we carry along with it a lot of other meaning that we have. The other reason that concepts are important is that they link our past and future experiences with the present. So if you recognize Lassie to be a dog, you can reasonably infer that Lassie has some of the same properties of the dogs you've met before and will meet in the future. In addition, concepts allow us to generalize new experiences. So if I know that Lassie and Fido are dogs, and I learn that Lassie and Fido have FRTG23, just a made-up property, in their cells, you can infer that other dogs might have it too. So concepts are important in in thinking, and especially in rational thinking. Now, there are a couple ways that concepts might change with age that might explain what's going on in this kindergartner's mind. One way that concepts change is in their relation to other concepts. We've already seen from the section on long-term memory that our concepts sort of exist in a semantic network with links to other concepts, such that when you activate one concept, the activation spreads to another concept. Another way that concepts are represented is that we have knowledge about the units of the concept. So what we know about dogs includes everything we know about every individual dog that we've seen. Our knowledge about the units of the concept are what we call schemas. We can illustrate these two different aspects to concepts by thinking just for a moment about our knowledge about islands. Right, so my knowledge about islands is sort of a peek into Professor Zupfer's concept of island. I know that islands are bodies of land, that islands are totally surrounded by water, that islands have beaches because they're surrounded by water, that the beaches are sometimes sandy with seashells, that people travel to islands where there's warm weather and palm trees. I know that Australia is the biggest island in the world. And for some reason that really bothers me, the combination of North and South America is not an island. Now, in my knowledge, part of this involves my knowledge about how islands are related to other things. So I know that Hawaii and Australia are both islands. They're both units of the concept, the things that are more or less interchangeable. I know that islands are land masses, but they differ from other land masses like peninsulas and continents, and they differ both in terms of their shape as well as their size. I know that land masses are different from other kinds of natural things like gold and rocks, and up and up and up the hierarchy. So that's one way that concepts might change with age, is we might think that Australia is not an island, maybe because we think that it's a continent, and we don't realize that it's an island too. Another thing that develops is the island schema. So a schema is sort of like an entry into a database, like an address book that has fields for your email address and somebody's cell phone number and their home phone number and all of that sort of thing. In the same way, an island schema has entries like what its next level of category is, landmass, what its shape is, any closed figure, what its material is, what its function is, what its size is. And any bit of those entries might be empty or filled in at different ages. So when we look at how concepts change, one way we can do it is using the strategy that Frank Kyle used. So he asked kids about two different kinds of questions. One set of questions had a defining feature of the category without the characteristic feature, and the other had the characteristic feature without the defining feature. So if you wanted to ask about islands, he'd say, for the first type of problem, on this piece of land, there are apartment buildings, snow, and no green things growing. This piece of land is surrounded by water on all sides. Could that be an island? So since it's a piece of land that's surrounded by water on all sides, it has the defining feature of an island, but it lacks the characteristic features of an island. There's apartment buildings and snow and no green things growing. In the other case, he has the characteristic features, but not the defining ones. So he tells them right off the bat, this is a place that sticks out of land like a finger. Coconut trees and palm trees grow there, and the girls sometimes wear flour in their hair because it's so warm all the time, as one does. There's water on all the sides except one. Could that be an island? And what he found is that for the concept island, 5-year-olds most often categorized by characteristic features. So if you look at the kindergartners, the thing that's the highest there is the plus C minus D plus C. Whereas 9-year-olds most often categorized by defining features. 4th graders are about 9 years old, and you see that they most often use the plus D minus C. And this pattern was observed for many other concepts that have defining features. So here's an example, the concept of uncle. So suppose your mommy has all sorts of brothers, some very old and some very, very young. One of your mommy's brothers is so young, he's only 2 years old. Could that be an uncle? Kid says, no, because he's little and 2 years old. How old does an uncle have to be? About 24 or 25. If he's 2 years old, can he be an uncle? No, he can be a cousin. So here, without the characteristic feature of being about the same age as mommy and daddy, the individual who might or might not be an uncle, and we know that it is an uncle because he is the mommy's brother, is being miscategorized. Here's another example. All right, so this man, your daddy's age, loves you and your parents and loves to visit and bring presents, but he's not related to your parents at all. He's not your mom or daddy's brother or sister or anything like that. Could that be an uncle? And kid says, yes. What's an uncle? An uncle is that he brings you presents at Christmas. What else? An uncle is that he let you come over to his house. Could I be your uncle? No, because I don't know you. If I got to know you and brought you presents, could I be your uncle? Yes. Sort of a stranger danger situation there. So there's a couple theories of what's going on in conceptual development in these kinds of cases. So one idea, was Piaget's idea, is that children are switching from their schema-based representation of the concept to a taxonomic or a taxonomic organization where their semantic network has kinds embedded within kinds. A more modern approach has a different view. The idea here is that kids' concepts do exist in a semantic network, but their concepts are heavily influenced by Q-validity, which I'll explain in a bit, and their knowledge of causal relations. The first idea, that their concepts are heavily influenced by Q-validity, is sometimes known as the information processing approach to concepts. And the second idea, that kids' concepts are heavily influenced by knowledge of causal relations, is sometimes known as the core knowledge approach to concepts. So let's look at Piaget's theory. So in Piaget's theory, Piaget just sees concepts as being equivalent to defining features. So an uncle just is the mother's brother or the aunt's husband. And the idea is that below about the age of 5, children are pre-operational or logic blind, and so they're not representing concepts in terms of kinds embedded within kinds. And so kids fail on tasks like Kyle's because they're basing their judgments on thematic relations, sort of what hangs out with what, rather than what kind of thing something is. And in support of this, Piaget had an object sorting task. So he might give the kids a bunch of dogs and cars and cats and chairs and tell them, put together what goes together. And the preschoolers would put the dogs and cars together because dogs like to ride in cars, and they put the cats and chairs together because cats like to curl up in chairs. Whereas the older kids would put the dogs and cats together because they said they're both animals, and they put the cars and chairs together because they're both made by people. Now, this is a very strange kind of task to give to kids. And this is a kind of criticism that came out of it, is when you give a kid a bunch of basically dolls, kids are likely to play with the dolls, not to perform some sort of psychology experiment with them. If any of you had Barbies, I bet none of you had as your characteristic way of interacting with Barbies, putting all of the bodies in one pile and all the clothing in another pile and all of the household goods in another pile and all the rest. That would be a little crazy. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that the preschoolers are treating dolls the way they normally treat dolls. It's just not the way that Piaget meant when he said put together what goes together, not what goes together in a scene, what goes together taxonomically, he wanted to say. Now, one way of removing this trap is instead of giving kids dogs and cars and cats and chairs, is to show them pictures of dogs and cars and cats and chairs. And this is what Jean Mandler did. Jean Mandler said maybe kids do represent these taxonomic relations, but in the context of dolls, they just find the thematic ones more interesting. So she showed kids, say, a triad of pictures, like a picture of a monkey, a picture of a bear, and a picture of a banana. And she'd point to the monkey and say, see this one? Can you find another one just like it? And what she found is that 1-year-olds chose the bear on 85% of the trials, choosing the taxonomic match rather than the thematic match. Another problem for Piaget's theory is that even on Kyle's task, kids sometimes use defining features, especially for moral terms. So it's not as if they go from only using thematic relations to only using taxonomic ones. Rather, at any given age, children might have multiple ways that they can think about concepts, and just the overall frequency of the taxonomic relations become more evident over time. And so if you look at something like the concept lie, kids make surprisingly philosopher-worthy judgments. So here's an example where we have the motive, means, and opportunity, all the characteristic features of a lie, but not the defining feature of an intentional falsehood. So this girl hated a boy in her class because he was so mean and did really nasty things to her. She wanted to get him into trouble, so she told the teacher all the nasty things the boy had really done. Could that be a lie? Or in the other situation, Kyle takes away the motive, means, and opportunity that are the characteristic of lies, but gives it the defining feature of an intentional falsehood. So this little boy always got good grades in school and prizes for being so smart. The other kids were jealous of him because of it, and he didn't want to make them feel bad and wanted them to be friends. So one time when he really got a good mark on a test, he told them that he got a bad mark so they'd be his friends. Could that be a lie? And here what they found is that for moral concepts like lie, 5-year-olds and 9-year-olds most often categorized by defining features. So we never see this characteristic to defining feature shift. Well, what's going on here? Well, the information processing approach begins with a slightly different view of concepts. The idea is that even for adults, many concepts are difficult to define very precisely. Wittgenstein, the philosopher, gives the example of game. Coming up with a precise definition of game turns out to be really hard. For just about any definition you can come up with, the philosopher will shoot it down with a counterexample. And they're really good at this, especially for game, which always makes it a little bit unfair when you play the game, the definitions game with a philosopher. But let's suppose that you had some time, like the philosopher does, to really work out a precise definition. That's a situation that exists at dictionaries. They often have boards who meet and come up with a nice, precise definition of a term. And the Oxford English Dictionary is one of the best. And I looked up, what's their definition of dog? Here's the definition. It goes, a quadruped of the genus Canis, of which wild species or forms are found in various parts of the world, and numerous races or breeds, varying greatly in size, shape, and color, occur in a domesticated or semi-domesticated state in almost all countries. These are referred by zoologists to a species Canis familiaris, but whether they have a common origin is a disputed question. Now I put to you, if some being came up to you and bit you on the leg, would you, using this definition, be able to tell if it's a dog or not? The fact of the matter is that there's nothing in this definition that tells you what a dog even looks like. The closest that it comes is telling you that a dog is a quadruped, meaning it has 4 legs. But other than that, Just about anything goes. It might be wild, it might not be. It comes in numerous races or breeds and shapes and sizes and colors and domesticated and wild and semi-domesticated. The only thing that would be helpful is if you had a zoologist who is walking behind every dog telling you, look, this here is Canis familiaris. But other than that, you'd have no way of knowing if it's a dog or not. And it's interesting. If you look at what dictionaries do for words like dog, is they often give you a picture. And that's what the definition doesn't provide. So instead of defining features, maybe, Rausch and Mervis proposed, concepts are represented in terms of probabilistic features. So for a concept like uncle, the defining characteristic, brother of father or mother, or husband of aunt, has a high probability, meaning all the uncles that you've ever met meet these, have this feature. All right. Other things maybe are not as defining and have a lower probability, like being nice or being about as old as one's parents. Some characteristics might be a coin toss as to whether your uncle is handsome or not. And the idea is that kids might decide whether objects are examples of one another by comparing the Q-validities. Okay. Now, the Q-validity of a feature is the degree to which the frequency of a feature accompanies a category member and the infrequency with which it accompanies non-category members. So, for a category like bird, flight is a highly valid Q. It's a highly valid Q because most, though not all birds, can fly, and because most, though not all non-birds, cannot fly. For something like uncle, all right, non-uncles never are the brother of your mother. Something like being handsome, very low Q validity because it's 50-50. Now, Q validities help us to explain quite a bit in the way that people make judgments of what category something falls into. So one thing is it helps to explain why adults are a lot faster to identify robins, which can fly, as birds, than ostriches, which can't fly. And with the additional assumption that kids are a little bit more conservative than adults, it explains why children are more likely to say that an ostrich is not a bird than to say that a robin is not a bird. And we know that infants in the first few months are already sensitive to Q validity. This is one way that they seem to be able to form basic concepts like cat on the basis of perceptual information. So Quinn and Imus showed 3 to 4 month old pairs of cat pictures. So if you look at the top row, they might see this pair of cat pictures, and then the next pair, and then the next pair, and just see cats and cats and cats and cats until they're bored with seeing cats. And then finally they're given a test trial, one being a cat and the other being a dog. Now what children did in this case is they spent a lot more time looking at the dog, which is novel, as well than they did the cat, which is novel too, suggesting that they were bored of seeing cats in general. So in some ways, they're treating these unique individual cats as alike, the way you would if you had the concept cat, whereas they saw a different dog as not like the other things. Now, the thing that's really interesting here is that 3 to 4 month olds have a much easier time forming the cat category than the dog category. And that makes a lot of sense. If you think about cats, they don't vary a whole lot in terms of their shape or in how big they are, or in the relation of their heads and legs to the rest of the body. But if you think about dogs as a class are extremely variable. Anything from a Great Dane to a Cocker Spaniel to that rat-like thing that Paris Hilton carries around in her purse. I guess it's a Chihuahua. This is an extremely diverse category. And so as a result, any of the features that have high Q validity for a cat don't have as high of a Q validity for dogs. And so the result is, since kids make use of Q validity, cat is an easier concept to form than dog is. There's another thing that this approach helps to explain, and that's the development of object concept hierarchies. So for any given object, say a lion, you can categorize it at multiple levels, from the most specific to the most general. So there's a lion, but the lion is also a cat. The lion is also an animal. The lion is also a living thing. Living thing, animal, and cat are higher level concepts in the hierarchy than lion. And philosophers have had all kinds of ideas on how concepts might develop. Is it from the most general to the most specific? That was Plato's idea. Or the most specific to the most general? That was John Locke's idea. Or does it go from the middle out to the other two ends? The only philosopher I could find who ever had that as an idea was the philosopher Ayn Rand. And what the information processing points out is that within a given hierarchy, there will always be a basic level category. That's the category where the Q validities are maximized. So in a triad like furniture, chair, and kitchen chair, chair is the basic level category because its features have the highest Q validities. So legs, a back, and a seat are associated with most chairs, but not beanbag chairs, whereas few other objects have these. Now think about what are the features associated with a kitchen chair. Well, a legs, a back, and a seat for sure, but that's also true of all non-kitchen chairs. What is the feature that has high Q validity for being a kitchen chair? It's basically just being a chair that's in a kitchen. So there's very few features that have high Q validity here. Same thing for furniture, right? The number of things that characterize furniture, but not non-furniture, is a very small number of features, right? And so it wouldn't be a basic level either. And what psychologists have found is that children typically form basic level categories before they form either superordinate or subordinate categories. So if you show children, the youngest children, a picture of a rose, the first thing that they'll say is that it's a flower. It'll only be at a later age that they'll add plant, and still at a later age that they'll add rose. Take a picture of a collie. If you show it to a young child, they'll just say it's a dog. When they're older, they'll say it's a dog, and then maybe add animal, and only later will they add collie. If you show them a picture of a Volkswagen, youngest child will just say that it's a car. A still older child will say it's a car, but then add Volkswagen. And still later will they say it's a form of transportation. So it seemed Ayn Rand was right, that children are starting with this basic level, this level where the perceptual qualities are the most important in deciding what the thing is. Now, there is one criticism of the information processing approach, and that is it's not always clear what features should matter and which won't. Let's take something like what a candle is. What distinguishes a candle from just a block of wax is its wick. But the wick is very tiny. Children will often overlook something like that entirely. And there's nothing in the theory that tells you what things the child's going to pay attention to. But most importantly, the features aren't unrelated. So it's not just that birds have a certain probability of building nests in trees and an independent probability of flying and another independent probability of having wings and still a fourth independent probability of having bird DNA. Rather, the features are non-independent. They're causally related. Birds build nests in trees because they can fly. They can fly because they have wings. They have wings because they have bird DNA. The features are causally related. And causal features are the most important and sometimes the most difficult features for children to grasp. So the core knowledge approach maintains that children's concepts don't just reflect a raw tabulation of the frequency of association. The children's concepts reflect their understanding of cause and effect relations. And over the long term, this is what matters. So when you know that your uncle is your aunt's husband or your father or mother's brother, you know certain other things. One is that since they're your parents' siblings, it's likely that they love mommy and daddy, and therefore pretty likely that they'll love you. All right. It also tells you that since it's your one of your parents' male siblings, it should be about the same age as your parents. So here, the features are linked together in a kind of causal diagram rather than just being associated willy-nilly. And there's support that this is an important thing that children make use of. Kruskam and Andrews provided two groups of children with identical descriptions of wugs, which you see on the left, and gillies, which you see on the right. But the important thing is that the experimental group was also told why wugs and gillies had the properties they did. They explained that wugs eat gillies, and because wugs eat gillies, they have this big spiky nose to stab the gilly in the belly, and big claws to rip off their skin, and a big spiky tail to bop them on their head. But gillies, of course, don't want to be eaten, so they have long floppy ears so they can hear the wugs from a long way away, and wings so they can fly up away, and they have spindly legs and a tail so that they can hang from the branches where the wugs won't eat them. And when kids are given this information, they actually do a better job categorizing new instances of wugs and gillies, as well as having a better memory for those categories when tested a week or longer later. So far what we've seen is some ways that children's concepts change with age. We've seen there's a shift from categorizing objects like island by characteristic features to categorizing by defining features. We've seen the development of superordinate and subordinate categories out of basic level categories like flower. And we've seen the development of long-term memory for new categories by learning how features are causally related to one another. In the next lecture, we'll look at how concepts are used then in children's thinking.